Hello everyone, welcome back to Lowlands Wargaming. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to take a look at some terrain. Recently we did a podcast episode on what makes for a good terrain board, what makes for good playable terrain, and also how to make your own terrain and how to acquire it, paint it, craft it, etc, etc, etc. Now of course a podcast doesn't really lend itself well to looking at terrain, so consider this video a little bit of a supplement, as it were, to that podcast episode where we're specifically going to look at some options for ruins. As you can see, I have quite a few ruins. And I specifically have two sets of ruins. I have the Arkenfell set over here, and on this side of the table there is the Games Workshop's own Gondor runes, which I also frequently mentioned in the podcast episode. So in the video I want to take a look at both of these sets of terrain and kind of go through them on terms of like playability, affordability, what it's like just to acquire them, build them, etc., play on them, things like that. And you can kind of follow along with the points, and then in the end we'll look at the specifics of each set of terrain, but first I want to kind of compare the two with each other. Let's start with playability. I think playability for terrain is the most important factor for myself personally. Like, it doesn't matter to me how beautiful a set of terrain is if your minis don't fit in it, or if they continuously fall off, or if you can't reach inside, then for me it's annoying to play with, and it also takes away out of my enjoyment for it. Also, I want it to be playable in more than just like physically playable, also more in terms of game mechanics. I want there to be rules and directions, or if it has different levels, for them to be accessible so that things can climb or jump or do all those kinds of things. And it just makes a gaming board a lot more interesting. You're just like a static field where there's maybe some choke points and that's about it, right? And I think both of these sets actually, for me personally, rank really high on the playability chart. They have both been designed with MESBG in mind. Well, obviously the Games Workshop stuff has been designed for MESBG, but the Arkenfell set in particular also kind of just has been designed to be Osgiliath from the game. And as you can see from these pieces, there are like nice, big, open staircases. The staircases themselves are a little bit too steep for minis, but that's also the same for the Games Workshop runes. And the levels can be taken off so that you can reach inside, and there's plenty of large doorways that you can move through with your minis, and lots of windows for shooting avenues and things like that. So it scores highly on like the playability front, lots of space for minis to move around and lots of line of sight things that you can do. And the same thing goes for the Games Workshop kits, where if you build it correctly, you can build as many levels as you want, and just have some really cool, awesome height possibilities in your terrain. And also if you use the archways and the staircases and landings and stuff like that, like I have, you can even make a network where all of your buildings can be connected on like the first level. Like I'll just lift this one up real quick. You can see I have a little pokey outy bit on the first level, or the second floor, depending on which country uses which domination. Anyways, the first floor off the ground floor, whatever that thing. If you use like little pieces that you can kind of connect them together, then suddenly you have a whole network of buildings that can be traversed without having to touch the floor, and you can play a game of the floor is lava with your minis, which is just really fun and really cool. So playability for both of them, awesome. Would rate it really high. Now obviously, the Arkenfell set is a 3D printed set. The Games Workshop set is a plastic cast set. These mean different things, and then we're talking about finish quality. So for the Arkenfell set in particular, we'll show you some close-up shots, especially of my painted pieces. You can really see some layer lines. Now, these don't bother me personally that much when we're talking about ruins, because it's kind of dirty anyways, kind of weathered, and the lines are in the direction of the brick, so it kind of looks like the brick just has that texture. But it's certainly not as great as the finish of the Games Workshop product because of the fine details that they can do with the plastic casting. Also, everything in the Arkenfell set is just more chunky, just by nature of the way it's crafted. It is incredibly solid though. You could throw this at someone and it would not break. The person might break before it does. In fact, our Lowlands Wargaming colleague Tim and I were saved by this terrain when a part of the window fell down on us that wasn't secured properly, and the terrain took the brunt of the damage, and all that happened was a single one of these points broke off, which I then managed to glue back together, which is a big praise for the durability of 3D printed terrain if done properly. So yeah, like I mentioned, the surface finish of the Games Workshop stuff is just absolutely phenomenal. Like each individual brick has texture on it. It is very much like repeating because it's all like individual components that's fully modular and you assemble. So you will start to see kind of like samey patterns, but the detail's fine enough that if you mix things up a lot and maybe use different colors of washes like greens and browns and stuff like that, kind of blend things together, you can kind of break up the monotony of these pieces that are kind of similar. And that's kind of I think an advantage for things like Arkenfell, where if the range of files is large enough, like Arkenfell is, you can just print every building once and you have so many unique buildings. Now, with the Games Workshop stuff, as you can see, you can also get a bunch of different unique buildings, but they will consist out of elements that are the same somewhere else. And you especially notice it with like the roof tiles, for example. They're always going to be like one thing wide, and then if you want them ruined, they're going to have a ruined texture edge. And if you like ruined roofs a lot, then you're going to see that a lot in your buildings, where it's the same pattern kind of repeated over and over, because that just kind of works that way. That's not really a complaint, just something to be aware of and something that you can fix with painting as well. Now, let's talk about the big elephant in the room. This is a lot of terrain, and you might wonder, geez, how much did it cost you? Funnily enough, these two sets are almost exactly the same in price. I had the Arkenfell set, the whole set that you see here, including some scatter pieces and things like that, printed by a 3D printer service here in the Netherlands that a lot of people buy things from. If you're from the Netherlands, you probably know who I'm talking about. And the Games Workshop set retails for more or less the same price that I got this Arkenfell set for. Keeping into account that this is not just the Mansion Ruins Tower kit, like that bundle, I also added the ruined pieces from the starter set. So that amount plus a little bit extra from the starter set is what you can see here on the table. So in terms of affordability, we're talking about 260 to 180 euros, that kind of range. Now, of course, this will vary wildly if you have your own 3D printer and you can get the Arkenfell files. Geez, try saying that 3 times quickly. If you can get those relatively cheaply, then of course 3D printing Arkenfell is going to be a lot cheaper than buying Games Workshop set. But if you don't have a printer, then it's actually surprisingly similar in terms of cost. And there are definite pros and cons to both of these. And we've already talked about a pro for the Games Workshop set, which is the higher detail value. But a large con for the Games Workshop set and pro for Arkenfell is just how easy or hard it is to assemble and get it ready for playing and for painting. Now for the Arkenfell set, I got the pieces and you just glue them together and leave things unglued where you want to have more access. So these are 3 pieces glued together, and then I left some of them unglued so that for playability reasons you can kind of access the lower levels more easily that way. And if you really want, you can drill them and put some magnets in to have it more easily. Now this piece is, I think, similar in size to, let's say, this piece, more or less. And this is probably about 100 pieces of plastic glued together. Let that sink in for a minute. 2 gluing operations, 99 gluing operations. So you can imagine that assembling the full table of Games Workshop Gondor Ruins is a lot of work, and it is. But what is actually the most work is taking every little bit off the sprues that they come in. It's beautiful terrain, and its modularity is just a stroke of absolute genius, the way everything fits together. But by God, does it take forever to get off the sprues and clean up and get ready for use. We'll edit in some photos of my setup of all of the little buckets that I had with sorted bits and components and things like that. And to get to that state, if I had to estimate, I think it took me anywhere between 8 to 10 hours just clipping things off sprues and removing the mold lines and clipping off the little sprue residue and stuff like that. Made tolerable by listening to podcasts and stuff like that, but definitely not a fun job. Assembling was more fun than preparing for assembling. Assembly is where you get to do the fun stuff, right? Play around with orientations, and it's like Lego for adults. It was really fun to do, but the preparation work was definitely a bit of a stinker. So next up, we should probably take a look at how well it goes to paintability and how well it will look as a final result. Now, I don't have any of the Games Workshop pieces painted yet. That's next on my to-do list. I want to finish up the Arkenfell first and then transition to Games Workshop and mostly stick to the same paint scheme. So it's hard for me to kind of really judge this. But just from my first impressions, the Arkenfell set takes really well to paint. It's mostly just, prime black, rattle can, gray Zenithal, washes, a bunch of gray dry brushes and multiple layers to really build up that volume over time, and then just do details like the wood, the tiles and things like that. And it works like a treat. So it's not much effort at all to get one of these pieces painted up to a decent standard. And from what I can tell from the Games Workshop set, it's mostly the same. It's really just a question of how far do you want to go? Because if you want to, you could spend countless of hours highlighting every little edge you want on both of these sets. That would take an eternity. But if you just want to use washes, dry brushing, a few choice highlights, maybe use some tufts or some runes or scatter or whatever to add a little bit of your own element to it. I think both of these are similar in terms of how well they take to paint. And it's more like, which aesthetic do you prefer? Like you can see on the table here and also in the close-up shots in a minute with the miniatures on them. They do feel a little bit different in terms of scale. Like the Arkenfell just looks a bit chunkier, the Games Workshop looks more refined, and that's mostly as a result of the different manufacturing methods. The plastic just allows itself to be smaller, and the 3D printing just needs a little bit more body mass to work properly. But I think both of them look gorgeous, they just don't look that well together. So usually I won't put them both on the same table. I will split them over multiple tables on an event. Now, last and not least, I want to talk a little bit about modularity and like different combinations that you can make with these two sets. And obviously here the big winner is going to be the Games Workshop terrain. You can do anything you want in terms of just assembling the buildings themselves, but also, like I mentioned earlier, if you're smart about how you use your components, you can chain your buildings together in such a way that they become like a larger whole. And with Arkenfell, you can't really do the same thing. There are a few pieces in the Arkenfell set, like ruined bridges and towers with bridging connecting pieces, that you can make like a walkway network, but it doesn't really link up to other buildings. So each building for Arkenfell is really more of a self-contained unit, and they don't really interact with each other in like a meaningful way. It doesn't mean you can't make a beautiful city with it, but you won't get those situations where you can really hop from one building to the next very easily, unless specifically you're using those like bridges and walkways set. That doesn't really work with other things at the same time. So Games Workshop set, big winner for modularity, really cool. If you want to make that kind of table, it's definitely a recommendation from my part. So let's talk about both sets a little bit more in detail and go over the specifics. I'm going to start with the Arkenfell because I have a little bit less to cover there. As you can see, there's quite a bit here, and when I bought Arkenfell, this is not actually already quite a while ago, I had a specific goal in mind. I wanted enough terrain that I could, if I wanted to, make a really full 4x4 table, too full for tournament play, but more for fun narrative games or like free-for-all games that I run with my friends. There's a really fun scenarios to do that you just use a boatload of terrain for, right? And particularly like this piece that I have right here, that's too large for a tournament table in general. So this never sees like tournament play. This is purely just here for a big centerpiece for like those narrative games to just really have a fun time with. And the idea here was that this piece I would disregard, and the rest, if I would split those up into two and then mix with other terrain like forests and rubble and that kind of stuff to create some difficult terrain areas, they would be enough together for two different tables. And that works. Like I kind of played around with paper templates. I put them on tables because the 3D printing service that I used had the dimensions listed on the website, so I could kind of cut it out of A4 paper and kind of play around and get a feel for just how many buildings I would need to really cover a board well. And when I had my mind set on the amount, I just placed the bulk order and got it all in. And then it was just a matter of assembling it, which was relatively easy, and priming it and giving it a Zenithal, and it was already ready for play. Of course, it's not fully painted at that point, but it looked good enough that it could be played on already on the board, which is really nice. So relatively little work for a lot of result. You just have to spend money, and that's why it's relatively expensive using a 3D printing service. Depending on where you live, the prices will range a lot. But in my mind, for my personal situation, it made a lot of sense to do it this way because I didn't really have an interest in buying a 3D printer for terrain. I have a 3D printer for minis, but you can't really print terrain with resin. You really do need a filament printer for that. And didn't make a whole lot of sense to spend hundreds of euros on a printer and then print this terrain when I could just spend a few €100 and get a printed terrain set and then just be done with it. But yeah, really happy with the Arkenfell set and how it's getting along. Now, when we're looking at the Games Workshop set, I've already mentioned a lot about how hard it was to assemble it, or rather how time consuming it was. There's just a few things I want to go into a little bit more detail and kind of show you guys. So I'll just take this building here as an example. You might notice that, and we'll also show this in the close-ups, that I have some 3D printed parts in here. So the Games Workshop kits don't actually come with many staircase pieces, and also not that many archways and banisters if you really want to use like height a lot. So you see a 3D printed staircase here. I have multiple 3D printed staircases in this building, and I just printed those to give myself a little bit more options for modularity and for height. You can also see the archway over there. That's just made with some leftover bits and mostly like 3D printed arches. Now they don't fit perfectly. I did have to do some finagling in the printing software to scale them down, and even then I kind of got a few millimeters off, so it looks a little bit wonky. But thankfully, all these buildings are ruins. If it looks a little bit wonky, well, that's just because the foundation's shot, because we're looking at an ancient ruin here, so it kind of works out, right? Another thing that I did, and I'm really happy with, I think I got this inspiration from Zorp or some other channel, or maybe people out of the community, because there's lots of people doing something similar, but it's cutting up the tower. So like the large kit has one large tower in it, kind of similar to how the Arkenfell set has a large tower. And I'm not a fan of large towers on gaming tables, because what happens is you're just gonna knock it over all the time, right? You're gonna bump into it, and it doesn't really do anything other than just be a huge line of sight blocker on one bit of the board, and not much else. So I decided I wanted to try and use the pieces a little bit more and use them to break up the silhouette of the Gondor ruins. Because at the end of the day, the system is fantastic, but it does lead to rectangles and squares only. So making a building where you have this little turret sticking out, just a half turret, is really nice. So I ended up cutting up those pieces in such a way that the floor over here lines up with the floor of the third level, second level, whatever, you get the idea. And by doing that for both this building and the building over there, by using both halves that way, it really creates a little bit of extra dimension for the two larger buildings that I made. But that gave me some cut-off pieces, and I decided to try to make the most of those and using some foam to make a little turret. And it even has a little Mines of Moria hatch in there that I literally have had laying around for 20 years waiting for this moment, and it's actually really cool. And this turret has the same in-game functionality and footprint as the actual full-size tower. It's still the same footprint, and in the game it will still block the same amount of line of sight, but you won't knock it over anymore. And I also have these beautiful turrets for these other buildings that way. So I really recommend this. It's not that hard to do. It's also not trivial, like you have to have like a nice file, like a nice saw, or I personally use a Dremel very carefully to cut the plastic rather than melt it, because if you use it too fast, it'll just melt the plastic rather than cut it. And that gave me a nice enough edge that I could just do some light filing and clean it up really nice. And now I just need to hide the crimes, hide the little crevices, because it's not glued in the way it was designed to. There's some gaps here and there, but that's nothing some putty or some foam work can't hide. It's definitely a recommendation if you're still having to tackle your ruin set or you're planning to order it. It's really cool to do it this way. At the end of the day, I think both of these terrain sets are really good contenders if you want to build your own table full of ruins. They both have their ups and downs, their pros and cons. And what it really comes down to is you have to ask yourself, do I want to spend the effort into making the Games Workshop Gondor ruins look good? Because believe me, it's a lot of effort. Whereas the Arkenfell set, or something similar, because there's plenty of other ruined STL files out there, it's really straightforward. If you have it printed, it's a similar amount of cost than just buying this from Games Workshop. You get the pieces, you just have to assemble and paint them, and it's so much faster to get on the table than the Games Workshop stuff. But in my honest opinion, the end result of the Games Workshop stuff is much higher, especially if you put the time and effort in. I'm planning to base these and scatter rubble all around and little crates and sleeping bags and things like that to make them come alive a little bit more. And the end result is really there because the level of detail is just much higher and you really have full control over it, and it creates some absolutely beautiful pieces. At the end of the day, the choice is yours. I just thought it was interesting to kind of compare these two options side by side as a little supplement to our podcast about terrain building. And now you can really see them and appreciate them in all their detail and all those points I also mentioned during the podcast. I think both of these were worth it for me. I really enjoyed building the Gondor ruins. I really enjoy the Arkenfell set. I've had many games with it already, and I will have many games with it in the future. For me, both of these were worth it. So maybe in the end, you also might get both. But if you had to choose, yeah, consider, what do you want? Do you want a quicker end result? Do you want a slower end result, maybe higher quality? Do you prefer the building process? Do you just not want to deal with all of that? These are ultimately the things that will maybe sway you in one way or another. Regardless, I also highly recommend getting a nice gaming mat for under them. I have the Medieval Ruins set from Deep Cut off the top of my head. It looks so good on it. It's really nice. It really makes it come alive, and it's a very pleasurable gaming experience on that. I'm curious, what are your favorite gaming pieces? Do you have like this piece of terrain that you always end up on your table just because it creates the best gaming moments? And what is a successful board like for you? I would like to learn from you just as much as you're learning from me. Please leave some comments, some suggestions, some questions down in the comments. I always enjoy interacting with you guys. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and see you next time at Lowlands Wargaming.